All right, now we're going to be talking about the Progressive Era, which we'll call maybe 1900 to 1916, something like that. Uh, but it's the general overview of it is it's a massive immigration to the United States, mostly from South and Eastern Europe by this time. There's a large economic expansion, and consumer goods start to flood the American market. Um, and also, by the end of this period, more Americans lived in town and cities than in the countryside, which will be the first time in American history that this is true. So that's kind of why we kind of talk about it as the urbanization and consumption part of American history. All right, so we're going to talk about the urban age and consumer society a little bit, but before we get to that, um, we're going to just talk about what happens at the turn of the century America. In the first decade, from 1900 to 1910, industrial output rose 85% in the country, which is astronomical. And basically, for the last time in the U.S. history, farms and cities grew together. I know that we ended talking about how all of these people were flocking to the cities, but at the same time, in 1900 to 1910, families were pouring into the plains uh, because there were still plenty of claims for the free government land that were filed under the Homestead Act. I don't know if you guys remember that, but in 1862, there was still a lot of land in the West that had not been claimed. Lots of land, especially in the Rocky Mountains where it was hard to get to, and even west of there. Um, but what another thing that happened was irrigation transformed the Imperial Valley of into California and Arizona into farming areas, meaning this is kind of grapes of wrath period, Tom Joad period, where people got in their jalopies and took Route 66 as far as they could, looking for better agricultural jobs in California, Nevada, parts of Arizona, parts of New Mexico, but mostly California. Also, but by about 1910, cities became the major focus of what we would consider to be called consumer society today. I'll give you some numbers. 21 cities in America had 100,000 people in 1910. New York had 30 or 4.7 million. Manhattan, which is about 26, 23, 24 square miles, the island, had 2 million by itself, which is more than 33 states in the Union at the time. And the thing about Manhattan kind of showed the dichotomy of American society because within 3 miles of Fifth Avenue, which was Millionaires Row back then, which we've kind of all heard of Fifth Avenue today, it's still a very nice place to live in Manhattan. But within 3 miles of that, there were tenements with no running water, toilets, or even electricity for that matter. And this is the 1900s. So at the same time, J.P. Morgan ran 40% of all financial industry and financial capital in the United States, right? So this is the time of books like The Jungle, I'm sure you've heard of, and journalists who muckrakers were journalists who kind of wrote about the underbelly of society. The Jungle is all about the sale of rotten meat in Chicago, and this led directly to the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act and Meat Inspection Act of 1906, which ends up becoming what we consider the FDA today. That's an Upton Sinclair book. If you're interested, it's long, but it's a very good example of kind of what society was in big cities back then at the turn of the century. Um, at the same time, immigration was big. From 1901 to 1914, 13 million people, mostly from Italy, Russia, Germany, and the Austria-Hungarian Empire, entered through Ellis Island. If you ever get the chance to go to New York, go look at Ellis Island. It's really quite an impressive feat to think of how many people actually went through there. 1 million people from Mexico came, and and it's interesting because you read some of the stuff that they write, and they really were looking for the American dream, or what people thought were the American dream, like freedom of worship, economic opportunity, emancipation from social hierarchies, right? All of these people are moving to America because everybody hears about democracy and all of these ideals, and so they pack up whatever they can, put their families on boats, and then they come to America. The whole idea of it all, like probably many of your grandparents or great grandparents, once they got here, was to assimilate and become as American as possible, or they would be made fun of. It wasn't that long. There's kind of this big push nowadays in America to retain your roots, right? Your social and your cultural roots. But in the early 1900s, when you came to America and you were from Italy, you made sure that your kids knew how to speak English. You didn't want them to speak Italian. You wanted them to speak English, and this is something that we call Americanization. Um, but at the same time, many parents had a hard time with this Americanization because a lot of their children were getting into relationships and marriages not for wealth, but actually for love. And they were getting jobs and they were paying for their own things, especially young women. In a lot of societies at the turn of the 20th century, women having jobs was frowned upon. But then they come to America, and these women start getting jobs and they start paying for their own things, and we'll talk a little bit about flappers next on the next PowerPoint. But this is something that parents really had a hard time dealing with. They wanted their kids to be American, but at the same time there were a lot of things uh, that they weren't too sure about. So, but at the same time, everybody kind of had their own ethnic cluster, and you've seen them: Chinatown, Thai Town, Germantown. Every city you went to, people kind of moved and lived where they were comfortable and where they could own their own shops, their own theaters. They could organize their communities, um, and even though they wanted their younger kids not to speak or to try to learn as much English as possible, all of these areas still spoke their native tongue, right? Um, at the same time, the idea of freedom in America changes quite a bit from 1900 to 19 from the populist time to the progressive time, and really what American freedom becomes is consumerism. Or what we call mass consumption today. This is when department stores come, chain stores in neighborhoods, mail order houses throughout the country, washing machines, sewing machines, vacuums, record players, amusement parks, dance halls, theaters, keep on and on and on. All of these things that we think of as American today, which entertain 25, 30 million people per year, Americans. Uh, these are things that are just coming to the forefront, and the thing about especially movies, which were called Nickelodeons back then because it only cost a nickel to get into, is that they were much cheaper than regular plays. So movies become kind of a big deal at this time as well. Also, you have women whose roles are changing thanks to the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and just because, you know, as societies evolve in general, uh, things change. Many started working for wages. Gender roles were changing in a sense, um, but for the most part, immigrant women had low-paying jobs such as working in houses as servants, maids, janitorial work, cleaning offices after business hours, things of that nature, while perhaps white women were maybe administrative assistants or secretaries or things of that nature. So, but either way, and we'll discuss role of women much later, or not much later, but next time, because they become much more influential in the 1920s, especially with World War One coming. So we'll talk more about women later. At the same time, you also had Fordism, which is named after Henry Ford. Uh, Even though Henry Ford did not invent the automobile, what he did do is he invented the technique of production and marketing that brought automobiles within the reach of every ordinary American, right? Uh, in 1908, the Model T, and there's a picture on the right-hand side of an assembly line, something he came up with. In 1902, the Model T comes out. It's simple, it's light, it's sturdy enough to navigate country roads, and it's a car that most people can afford. Um, Although the first 1908 Model T was not created by an assembly line, by 1913 in Highland Park, Michigan, Henry Ford kind of masters the assembly line, which is basically all it is a moving line in which the cars were brought to the cars were actually brought to the workers, right? And then the workers sat in a line and they each had a job to do, and they did that job, and the car was created, right? You only had one job to do. At the same time, in 1914, he raised wages at his factory to an unheard of level, $5 a day, right? So that's almost double anything anybody had ever seen before. And so what this does is he gets all of the skilled workers. So he basically outbids everybody for their workers. And so by 1914, he has most of the best workers in America working for him. Uh, Apparently, he was quite the anti-Semite, and he was a bit of a racist as well. So he's kind of this figure he created the assembly line. He raised minimum wage higher than anything, at unheard of levels, but at the same time, he had some faults as well. Um, when people criticized him for endangering his profits because he was paying his workers too much, uh, he's he kind of came up with the trickle down economy that we'll talk about later. And he basically said workers have to be able to afford the goods that they're building. Okay, so he said you shouldn't have to be able to build a car, but then not afford it, right? The reason why you're building this car is to make money so you can afford it. So in that sense, he was a good man in that sense. So um, a few numbers about the output of a typical Ford plant. In 1910, he went from putting out 34,000 cars at $700 a car to 1916, 730,000 cars, and they each cost $316 a piece. So this was well within the reach of most workers, right? Well within the reach. That's, you know, that's a year's worth of work, which is, when you think about it, that's basically what well, not anymore, but at the time, that's basically what a car cost. Okay. Um, here's another thing. Sales wise, in 1900, they sold 4.1 thousand cars in 1900. In 1925, they sold 4 million, right? So you can see the difference between numbers and price tag of these cars, and this is one of the few reasons why America is a car society today. Besides, it's so big, and we don't have a good infrastructure for public transportation. But one of the main reasons for that is because of the car lobby, and because cars were a very important part of the American economy for a very long time, and they still are today. So to end this, just to note, what is happening after 1900 is this shift from capital goods like steel, railroad equipment, uh, mining machines, big machines, all of these this heavy industry, to consumer goods, to cars, to washing machines, uh, things of that nature. And there's this shift from big stuff to small stuff, and this really is becoming the American way of life. Okay, so as this consumer society becomes larger and workers become more, then you get ideas of how to humanize industrial capital and kind of find common ground between the producers, the people who work, and the middlemen and the people who run and the owners. All right. And this is where the Socialist Party steps into American society. Uh, and their whole platform was talking about economic freedom, free college, legislation to improve workers' conditions, with the ultimate goal of a kind of a democratic control over the economy with public ownerships of railroads and factories, right? So they were looking for the government to take over most of the railroads and the factories in order to create a better life for the people who work there. It actually became somewhat famous, or popular. By 1912, they had 150,000 members. They had newspapers in Manhattan, St. Louis, Oklahoma, a lot of the working class areas in Cincinnati, Cleveland, the Midwest, places like that. Um, and the main man of the Socialist Party was Eugene Debs, Eugene V. Debs. He was a railroad union leader who had been jailed during the Pullman strike of 1894. I'm not sure if we talked about that or not. If you're interested in that, that's something that you can look up, the Pullman strike of 1894. And so for the next 2 decades, he went around the country preaching about control of the economy by by democratic means, and he really held out the hope for political and economic freedom for everybody. And when we say economic freedom for everybody, we're talking about being able to work hard, work your 10 hours a day, and then having the freedom to buy what you can, being able to buy bread, milk, things of that nature. That was kind of their platform. Actually, in the 1912 election, which was a very important election in U.S. history, they got 900,000 votes, which was almost a million, which is 6% of the vote. So I'm just trying to give you this. That's the first variety of progressivism. There's more that come along. Women also had their own variety of progressivism, and one of them was led by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. She wrote the book Women in Economics, and she kind of tries to use working women as a symbol of a female emancipation, right? Like they have this spirit of freedom because she says really, and this is kind of where feminism really takes a hold with Gilman, is she says the housewife is kind of like a parasite, right? Because all she does is suck money from the husband who's making all the money, right? She lives off of him. She has no way of living besides off of him. And she says when women are forced to the domestic drudgery of everyday life, of cleaning house every day and taking care of the children's, that makes them incapable of actually contributing to society or basically enjoying freedom in any sense of the word. All right. So what she does is she has all of these, in Women in Economics, she devises these plans for like nurseries and cafeterias and laundries and all of these places to help married women get out of the house so they can go get a job, right? She's basically advocating childcare so that you can have two family members who work, because a woman in the house is not that productive. And this is a very, very influential text for 20th century feminists. Okay. But she's not talking about child rearing. She's talking about housework. And she says even wealthy women really aren't that free, because the only reason why they're wealthy is because their husband gives them what they want. And she says that's not freedom. She says, you know what's freedom? Going and working for minimum wage in a factory, but earning it by yourself, right? She says, all girls do not like to sew. Okay, so she says, she's basically saying a woman needs to go out and do what she needs to do to be happy. And she says, you know what makes most women happy? Is not being stuck in the house all day. Okay, so this is a very important text for 20th century feminism. And this is really when feminism starts entering the vernacular of just everyday life, right? The whole argument is we need emancipation as a human being and as a sex being, meaning because we're a woman. And the whole argument, because women don't have the vote yet, and the whole argument goes back to before, saying, there are some immigrants, there are some freed slaves and their children who have votes, and yet women don't, right? So that's the whole idea. At the same time, there's other women like Margaret Sanger, who not only expresses the demands, such traditional demands, such as we want the vote and economic opportunity, but she even goes farther and says women should be able to express themselves sexually freely, and we should also have the choice of whether we use birth control or not. And at this time period, in the early 1900s, even talking about taking birth control was illegal. Okay, and so in 1916 she actually talks about it, and she opens up a clinic and starts distributing birth control, and she gets arrested for a month. This is Margaret Sanger, and what she calls it in parentheses is free motherhood, meaning getting pregnant was a voluntary, intelligent decision to remake the world, right? She says women who want to and are capable of raising a child, then they should be able to have a child. If they don't want one and they're not capable but they get pregnant, there should be a way for them to not have that child if they don't want it, okay? And she says the worst off people in this whole country aren't immigrants. It's not freed slaves. It's not the freed slaves' children. It's the wives of industrial workers, because they bear all of the brunt of being poor, but they also have no contraception. So these women are having 4, 5, 6, 7 kids that most half of these kids are probably dying, but she's basically saying the wife of an industrial worker she may live till she's 30 if she's lucky, and 8 to 9 years of her 30 years of her life she's going to be pregnant, right? She's probably going to have 2 or 3 kids who don't live, but she's still probably going to have 4 or 5 kids that do live, and she has to bear the brunt of that, right? And since workers don't really have free time, then the mother is raising these childs by themselves. And what Margaret Sanger says, one of her all-time famous arguments is a free race cannot be born from slave mothers, right? No woman could be called free who does not own and control her body, including whether to have a child. Now you think about how controversial that would be today. Think about America 120 years ago, right? This was unbelievably progressive at the time. And this is another variety of progressivism that's coming out of this whole urbanization and this how people are living in squalor and they're having too many children, and she's saying this needs to stop, and it needs to stop now. And suffrage really moves, the suffrage is the right for women to vote, really beyond the elitism to this mass movement. Membership in the National Women's Suffrage Association grows to 2 million by 1917. I mean, it was only a couple thousand in the in the 1890s, and it's in 2 million by 1917. By 1900, more than half the states allowed local votes. Wyoming, Colorado, Idaho, and Utah had adopted full suffrage. And one by one, states follow suit. But the thing about these places allowing women's suffrages is because they needed women to move there, because it was a little rough and it was still the frontier. So one way to get women to move out there was to allow them the vote. And that's why places that are considered conservative today, besides Colorado, because weed's legal in Colorado now, but at the time it was very conservative, and the reason why they did this is because they needed women to come out there. But no matter the reason why they did it, they still gave women the right to vote. At the same time, Progressive also believed that the government should expand liberty kind of by regulating economic activity towards the public interests. Progressives thought not so much a planned economy, but they thought that they're democratic and what we would consider a Democrat today, in the sense that they believed that the government had a social contract with the people, right? If things were going wrong for people, then the government needed to do something about it, right? And so this is kind of where the Democrats of what we think of Democrats today come from, is this ideal. And so during this time, democracy was enhanced with the 17th Amendment, and the U.S. senators voted by popular vote that election of judges and primary elections among party members would be voted by senators, or would be voted by popular vote rather than state legislators. So the whole idea is the 17th Amendment made the United States a more direct democracy, in the sense that the normal people were allowed to vote for their senators and their House and their representatives. It wasn't the people they voted for who voted for the senators and the House of Representatives. So with the 17th Amendment, direct democracy really comes to America in one sense of the word, not in all senses, but in this sense of the word. Especially voting for U.S. senators, right? At the same, and this was all kind of because of this movement towards this progressive movement towards treating people equal, and everybody needs the right to vote and such. All right. There was also this real large movement towards natural rights. And natural rights are kind of, you can kind of define that as civil rights, in the sense that everybody deserves an amount of liberty and action. They have a right to live. They have a right to marry who they want to, and other basic freedoms that we kind of take for granted, but at the time they may or may not have been occurring in America. And one of these natural rights was a living wage. So this is interesting, because a living wage it's not an original or universal right. When we talk about human rights and things like that, we don't talk about the right to earn a living wage. This is something is new, that has come up since industrialization, right? Or since the wage system came into occurrence, since the idea that you have to check in at 7 o'clock and you have to work from 7 until 3 o'clock, right? This whole time a wage system. And the whole idea of the living wage is that private property is morally legitimate because it's kind of the best method to enable man to realize his natural rights, and it's the best way that a man can kind of develop men, as in men and women, to develop their personality, right? Private property means I own this piece of land and I can do with it what I want because I own it. And that's kind of what every American wants, right? That's kind of our top priority as Americans. But that doesn't mean that you should live in abundance when other people are starving, because that's not just. That's basically a crime. It's the whole idea of a living wage and natural rights is that it's kind of all about the dignity of being a human, and being able to have food, clothing, shelter, and kind of an opportunity to develop, physical, intellectual, moral, and spiritual faculties, right? And what a lot of the progressives are saying is all of this rests upon the state, because in the natural world, people won't do that. People are going to try to get as much property as they possibly can, and you may or may not care whether your neighbor has more than you or less than you in that sense. So that's kind of how the progressives view natural rights. And they're saying there's only one way that you can make sure everybody gets what they need in society, and that's if the state does it. At the same time, Spokane was a very important city in at the turn of the century, because this is where the IWW really comes to the forefront. And the IWW is the Industrial Workers of the World. And what these guys do, this union does, is it kind of fights for free speech. And one of the main meetings that they have of the whole time is in Spokane. And really what it is it's about letting laborers unionize and making sure that newspapers don't tell lies about laborers and socialists and unions, and trying to make sure that everybody gets a fair shake. Like I said, whether you believe in unions or not, and by the way, this is an interesting fact, there's more unions in the United States today than there are in France, right? Can you believe that? That's amazing to me. But what the IWW is saying, that you have been systematically, especially in Spokane, the Spokane meeting, they said you've been systematically lied to by the newspapers, by the government, and these are socialists, and they're saying the bottom line is we want workers to have as much of an opportunity to a living wage as anybody else. And they say the reason why this isn't happening is because the government and other entities who run this country, the government, the private companies, Standard Oil, U.S. Steel, things like this, are keeping you down. All right? And one of the really big meetings of the IWW, which was led by Eugene Debs, was in Spokane. The thing that maybe made them more effective than anything is when they got to Spokane and they started having these rallies, they immediately many immediately were arrested and sent into what people call sweat boxes. Police call sweat boxes. You know, uh, they'd put them in kind of outhouses, so to speak, when it was really hot, and just let them sit there and fry, kind of like saunas. Or they'd do the opposite, and they'd put them in cells and pour ice all over them. Right. So one of the reasons why the IWW, especially in Spokane, kind of had this romantic version, or people started really talking about them, is because of the poor treatment they got from the police, which is, you know, you turn it into today, it's the same exact thing. When people who protest against something and the police start behaving badly, then that just helps their cause a little more. So that's just kind of, I wanted to put that in there just because Spokane was one of the main places where this was occurring. Lastly, there is one actual occurrence that I want to talk about, and this is on the right-hand side, and this is the Triangle Fire of 1911, which is in Greenwich Village, New York. You've probably heard of it. They call it the Village. That's where Bob Dylan and all of those guys hung out. Kind of the culture capital of America in the 1960s. But before that, it was mostly Jewish and Italian young women who worked there, because there was a lot of sweatshops there, sewing sweatshops. And in one of the buildings, a fire breaks out. But when the women run to get out, they realize that the doors were locked on the outside to stop unwarranted bathroom breaks and to make sure that nobody stole from them. So basically what it is these women were locked into this sweatshop and they didn't even know it. But then the fire starts, and then so the picture on the right, which is a bit gruesome, is a picture of women who had jumped out of, I think it was like the 16th floor, and died on their way down because they had nowhere else to go. And so in the end, over 100 people died, and 46 of them leapt to their deaths. And the reason why the death toll was so high is because the water hoses could only reach the 6th floor, so they were way too high for the water hoses, not to mention they were locked in. And so this is kind of an example of why the IWW and socialists and unions actually, in some sense, gained popularity, was because of things like the Triangle Fire, where people said, well, maybe things aren't going exactly how they wanted to. Maybe these Jewish women and Italian women weren't really living the American dream. They were just basically working in sweatshops, and then they had to leave to their death or burn to death. So this is just an example of, I wanted to get that out there, of why socialists almost got 1 million votes in the 1912 election, and why the IWW and why things like natural rights were so important to people, is because of things like this. All right, so the progressive political movement really starts with the McKinley assassination in 1901. The president was assassinated by an anarchist named Leon Czolgosz, who was immigrant from the Balkans. He assassinated McKinley in Buffalo because he had lost his job in 1893, but without going into too much detail, around the world at this time, anarchists were assassinating a lot of political figures in Europe and Russia at the time, and he felt that it was his duty to keep on the tradition. At the time, the vice president was Theodore Roosevelt, and he was only 42, so he was the youngest ever president in the history of the U.S. And in many ways, he was kind of the model 20th century president, where he was actively He was active and continuous in both foreign and domestic problems. What he really did was come up with the Square Deal, which was a domestic program, but that distinguished between good and bad corporations, right? Ones who served the public interests and those who were run by greedy financiers. So, when he came to office, he quickly started doing things like passing antitrust laws, um, which was basically the idea that one company couldn't have a monopoly over too many things. So, for example, one thing was the Northern Securities Company, which was a holding company created by J.P. Morgan, and it owned and ran three different railroads. So, what uh, Roosevelt did is he broke up these trusts, so to speak, and said, you need competition to drive prices lower. Um, and this company had also monopolized the transportation from Salt Lake to the Pacific, and in 1904, with the help of Teddy Roosevelt, it was dissolved. At the same time, Teddy Roosevelt also had the conservation movement, which was all about preserving parts of the natural environment from economic exploitation. Um, Although Yellowstone was created in 1870, uh, Roosevelt also came talked about national forests, national reserves, national parks. He created Rocky Mountain National Parks. All of these things. He basically he was an outdoorsman in the sense that he looked at how beautiful America was and he said, well, a lot of this needs to be saved because if we don't do anything about it, timber companies, railroad companies, mining companies, things of that nature are going to come in and destroy it. And that's not what he wanted at all. In the 1890s, just before TR came to the presidency, John Muir had created the Sierra Club to preserve forests from logging, and later Congress authorized this through Roosevelt for forest reserves. And a lot of this had to do with the help of Gifford Pinchot, which you all know it was a big name up in here. And so not only did they just preserve it from exploitation, but they also used it to study scientifically and in a sense how to develop the use of force without depleting them, right? So here's this guy who was a hunter and kind of a man's man and probably killed a lot of people in the Spanish-American War, but at the same time he was a conservationist, he was an antitrust guy, so he was kind of a mixed bag of things, right? You couldn't really put a pinpoint on him. At the same time, in 1908, Roosevelt does not run for presidency, even though he could have. He ran out his term, both terms as McKinley's vice president. After McKinley was assassinated, he became president. He ran 2 terms, even though it wasn't illegal then. The term limit was set after FDR, after he passed away, but instead, in 1908, Roosevelt doesn't run, and he chose as his successor Taft. Taft kind of pursued much of what Roosevelt was doing, especially with his antitrust objectives, but he did it even more aggressively. For instance, in 1901, Taft got the Supreme Court to call Standard Oil, which is Rockefeller's Standard Oil, one of the biggest companies in the country. He called them in on violation of antitrust laws, and he asked the Congress to break it up. And the Supreme Court actually does. And at the same time, they also passed the 16th Amendment, which is a gradual income tax, which was basically a 2% tax on income above $4,000, and which kind of once an income tax comes comes into play, you kind of have this flexible and reliable source of revenue for the government, and a lot of this was growing rapidly because many of the immigrants, with the influx of immigrants, higher birth rates, as medicine gets a little better, so lower death rates. As all of this starts occurring, income taxes go up, and America begins kind of having this influx of tax money coming into them. So even though Taft did kind of followed Roosevelt's line of thinking, and the government was making more money than they had before, what really comes to the forefront is the election of 1912, which is maybe one of the more contested, somewhat interesting elections in American history that people haven't heard about. And this kind of to the forefront comes Woodrow Wilson. And the thing about the 1912 election is it was a four-way election, but basically what it boiled down to was Woodrow Wilson versus the new progressive Teddy Roosevelt. Taft, through a whole series of things that you can't get into, maybe this is something you'd like to do your PowerPoint on. Taft and Roosevelt kind of had a falling out. So Taft ran as the Republican in 1912, Wilson ran as the Democrat, and Teddy Roosevelt ran as the progressive. Okay, but what Wilson ran on was what he called a new freedom. He believed even further that the federal government should start strengthening antitrust laws. He believed the government should protect the right to unionize, and he really wanted to encourage small business. At the same time, he's not a Democrat, what we would consider to be a Democrat today, because he still was afraid of big government. In fact, he was more afraid of big government than big business at the time, because he says, really, both are corrupt. It doesn't, whether you have a big government or you have a big business, either way they're going to be corrupt, and it's actually quite prophetic. What Woodrow Wilson says is the government needs to distance itself from these big corrupt companies, because he says what has started out as this kind of capitalistic idea of free enterprise and free competition has really become patronage and special privileges. He's basically saying what's happening is lobbyists are taking over. Right, and this is the argument that people have today, right, all of the time, about big business or big government, which one's better, or either of them, that good, really. And he's also, Woodrow Wilson also argued that these companies are so big now that they're above the law. They can do things and the government can't stop them, and nobody can stop them because they're so big, right? So Woodrow Wilson in 1912 is making a lot of the same arguments that people make into today about big businesses. But what he says is the government can and should be able to take away their power by regulating competition and making it impossible to create monopolies. Right? But at the same time, he says liberty and freedom is not something that comes from the government, but from its subjects. Because he says the whole history of liberty and the whole idea of it is a history of resistance, right? He says the whole idea of freedom is limited government. So really, he's a Republican, what we would consider to be a Republican today. But the difference between what him and Teddy Roosevelt believed is Roosevelt believed big business and government could live hand in hand. He thought that even though Roosevelt was antitrust, he thought if you could whittle a company down small enough, and you made sure it wasn't corrupt, and you could have a small government, with smart people who weren't corrupt, then everybody could live hand in hand. But that's kind of utopian thinking, right? I mean, that's what everybody wants. The problem is the government was getting too big, but so were the companies. Everything was getting too big, and there wasn't really any oversight to it. So what happens is because Teddy Roosevelt kind of drifted away from the Republican Party, he creates this Progressive Party, and they create their own platform. And we'll just go through a few things real quickly of what they are, and then we'll discuss who wins the election, and what next time we'll discuss what that means to the country. The progressive platform, and the progressives got all kinds of people, like we discussed: female activists, labor reformers, scientists, and a lot of women's suffrage. And basically what they were trying to do is lay out a blueprint for a modern democratic welfare state in the sense that you had federal supervision of corporations, national labor and health legislation for women and children, an 8-hour workday, a living wage for all workers, social insurance covering unemployment, medical care, old age, which we call Social Security. And the whole argument of the progressive platform, especially Teddy Roosevelt, said the reason that we have political parties is because they're supposed to be going for the people's interests. But he says that stopped happening after Abraham Lincoln, and so he says nobody really owes any allegiance to anyone, right? That's and what he says is, he calls it the unholy alliance. He says there's not really, even though everybody kind of is connected in one way or the other politically, he says nobody really owes anybody anything, and he says everybody's out for themselves. So the Progressive Party come up with this platform, and we'll just go through a couple things of what they want to accomplish. The first one, the main one, is the rule of the people, right? What they wanted was direct primaries for all state and national officers, direct election of senators, and a short ballot, meaning a vote for important things, and if there were smaller things and smaller elections, then you just do that by appointment, so the ballot's not out of control. So basically what they're arguing for is direct democracy in the voting of the president, the senators, the House of Representatives, governors, people of the larger variety, but in the small city council, sheriff, things of that nature, to have some type of appointment by these larger entities that were already voted in, so that the ballot doesn't become huge. Because the whole argument is the bigger the ballot is, the more the corruption there is, and the less people are going to want to vote. If they have to vote for 25 people, they're not going to vote. If they have to vote for 4 people, yeah, they'll go vote. The difference between the nation and the state is that the state should have the same laws, especially when talking about freedoms of those oppressed. So what he's saying is all people should be able to vote. Because the federal government has passed the 14th and 15th Amendment, he's talking about the South. He says, especially the South, he is saying anybody who is an American citizen should be able to vote. And not just Teddy Roosevelt, these are progressives in general. And he says the nation takes precedence over the states in this capacity. He thinks that courts should have their power restricted, and he really thought that people should have the overall authority things. For instance, when an act is passed and it is called unconstitutional by the court, then the people have the right to vote on it, right? He's basically saying we don't need the Supreme Court state Supreme Court or federal Supreme Court telling us what's constitutional and unconstitutional. If or, or they have the final ruling. If they say it's unconstitutional, then the people should be able to vote on it, whether it is or not. Okay. Um, the Progressive Party was much about social justice as well, so they wanted legislation to prevent industrial accidents, diseases, overwork, involuntary unemployment, and child labor, women who are pregnant, giving them time off, anything that was injurious in a modern industrial city, right? Um, they wanted safety and health standards. They wanted federal control of interstate commerce and the taxing power to maintain such standards. So anybody can. So the whole argument of the progressives is anybody can make a law, right? But you need to be able to tax, and you need to be able to have some type of authority to overlook those laws. And so they're saying it's well enough that you can pass an 8-hour day, but if you can pass an 8-hour day but you can't enforce it, then what's the point? And so their whole idea is then you just got to tax more, so you create entities that will be able to enforce these laws. We talked about other things that they talked about: child labor, minimum wage for women, no night work for women, 1 day's rest in 7, no more convict labor, which was a very big deal in America at the beginning of the 1900s, but rather contract labor so they can support families on the outside, so basically paying prisoners to work. They wanted full disclosure of wages, hours, and accidents, right? So if somebody got their finger cut off at the sawmill in Wallace, Teddy Roosevelt and the progressive said, you need to put that in the paper and you need everybody to know that that happened, right? And like we said before, they're talking about Social Security and welfare for the unemployed. They were really big on literacy. The progressives wanted every single American to be able to know how to read, and they were very much a union-centered party. They believed that unions help the workers get the best wages possible, and that is not a bad thing when that occurs. They also talked about health, which we talked about a little bit. They wanted a national health service without discrimination that the federal government ran, with hospitals, schools of medicine, Medicare, Medicaid, things like that. Kind of sounds somewhat familiar today, because that's kind of what the United States is discussing today. And lastly, they were talking about business. What they really wanted was a strong regulation of businesses, of interstate corporations that send goods throughout the country. They wanted to make sure that they were doing everything kosher, because a lot of that was secretive at the time. It may still be. And Roosevelt's argument is too many corporations and businesses have power over the daily lives of too many Americans, because with this urbanization that was occurring, basically your life was wake up, go to work, go home, eat, hopefully play with your kids, go to sleep, do it again. That was your life. And Roosevelt said there's too much of that. They have too much responsibility over human beings' daily lives, and that needed to change. They also argued that U.S. Steel, Standard Oil, places like that had a monopoly of natural resources: water, minerals, timber, steel, iron ore, etc., and that just makes it unfair. They said if only 2 companies in the country are able to get this, then that is unfair. He says everything needs to be made common knowledge, And then this is where we get the Interstate Commerce Commission, which will, even though at the beginning will not be able to enforce all the laws that it creates, it will give legitimate business laws that are comprehensible and that people should follow. Okay, so all of this is on the progressive platform, and most of this comes out of this whole idea that America is becoming urbanized, and with urbanization becomes factory work, uh, begets large families, kind of squalor, people working for lower than minimum wage. And so the progressives, uh, headed by Theodore Roosevelt, argue that things are going in the wrong direction. Unfortunately for the progressives, and unfortunately for Taft, what ends up happening is too many people were split. It was basically two Republicans running against each other, and so what ends up happening is 1912 is that Woodrow Wilson wins, and we will pick up next PowerPoint in 1916 and the middle of World War I, and what Woodrow Wilson believes is the right thing to do for the country, as many people did. Most people in 1916 in America were against going to war in Europe, and we really don't go to war until 1917. So the 1912 election was a very important election at the time, because it kind of set the standard for how and what the United States did for World War I, and Woodrow Wilson won that election.